This is my indie horror game about the stress of life and the struggle of the creative process. I spent about 100 hours on it so far, with no real talent and no experience in coding or game art. I will show you what 100 hours of talentless suffering with no experience will actually get you. And trust me, you're gonna be surprised at where most of the time is gonna go.
Okay.
So the whole game will take place inside one apartment. The idea is to have a day cycle where you work and earn money, and then a night cycle where you try to survive the stress that you've accumulated over the day. So to start off, I wanted to allow the player to move their character around the apartment by clicking on specific objects. So make this little capsule move to that little box over there and BAM! That's 3 hours of my life just gone. I then made some initial UI in the form of a working clock and a money counter. I followed this up by setting up the camera and filling the apartment with some initial models that I found on the asset store. I then added texture to everything, and yep, that was another 6 hours gone. To make the scene look a little cooler, I added lighting and post-processing effects. In addition, I wanted to have the camera follow the player a bit as they walked around the room, so I added that, and then finally, I wanted the scene to look more realistic to a certain extent, so I did some light baking. Every time I wanted to do another baking round, this would cost me 5 to 10 minutes, and this made the whole ordeal take another 4 hours. I then decided that I really hated the models that I chose, so I replaced them. And this idea of backtracking previous decisions will unfortunately be more of a reality than I wanted it to be. With the new models in place, I added a few more lights and did some initial touches to the night mode, where the player would be looking around in first person instead of top down. This was another batch of 5 hours of work. I tweaked the room a bit more, wrapped up some of my shitty code in about 3 more hours, and by then I was 21 hours in. I had some basic game logic and the start of something looking okay. The player can click on a desk and start working, time will pass, and stress will accumulate, together with some money. The next step I wanted to take was to give some love to the night sequence, aka the actual horror part of the game. During the night, the player will count sheep to try and fall asleep. And they need to do this while ensuring that the stress doesn't get to you. But we're not ready to implement that just yet. I started with implementing the sheep spawning and the ability to make them jump by clicking. I then tied that to the amount of stress that the player has accumulated over the day, and then in turn made it so that the amount of sheep you counted reduces your stress for the next day. I was able to make this sheep thing in about 5 hours. I then needed the night to look as the night. This was a bit more tricky than I anticipated because I used the thing called light baking. I messed around with it a bit and was able to fix it in about 3 hours. I then did some cleanup, tweaked the camera position, and made it so that you had to earn a certain amount of money before the end of day 7. This was another 4 hours to get it all in a nice little package and loop together in a way that made sense. And we already have quite something. We have a small little loop, some visuals, and the ability to move a character and make sheep jump. However, the real challenge was just about to get started.
So stupid.
You see, the more I add, the harder it's getting to keep things working. Adding one thing can break something else, and tweaking the camera, for example, can break a whole bunch of features. Since I'm a talentless idiot, I don't really build things correctly. And unfortunately, this will start to really bite me in the ass later down the road. However, for now, I wanted to put my attention back to the day cycle. I wanted the player to have more options and manage more things than just deciding when to work and when to sleep. To facilitate this, I needed some sort of menus that would open if the player selected something he could interact with. I wanted to add buttons and the ability to pause the game while a menu is open. Adding this single button took me a good freaking 4 hours. Adding buttons in Unity with different perspectives really sucks. I then added other things that the player could do. For example, play games on the couch to reduce their stress. So in this scenario, they would trade time for stress removal instead of money. This was about 2.5 hours of work. I then wanted to tweak the buttons a bit and followed this up by making the greatest mistake of my life. I added an outlines package. This package created a bunch of bugs that I didn't understand, and fixing those together with the button tweaks costed me a crisp 3.5 hours. The kicker to all of this is that the bugs are still there and I actually didn't fix anything. The next feature I focused on was to add a hunger meter and the ability to buy and eat food. If you were too hungry, you would now work at a slower pace. I then followed this up by having an existential crisis because I forgot to record, and then worked on the next feature, which was hygiene. Hygiene would make it so that if you were too dirty and still working, you would get stressed even faster. I then thankfully recouped from my existential crisis and allowed the player to take showers to increase their hygiene for the cost of time. I did all of this in just over 7 hours. Alright, by now we are at the halfway point. And I want to take a step back and explain that I've been doing this for over 2 months by this moment. I do this as a hobby alongside my full-time job and my other life-related responsibilities. So all in all, accumulating 50 hours of spare time, so to say, is no easy feat. I want to ensure that whoever is watching this and is maybe interested in doing this yourself knows that this just takes time. Don't feel discouraged by the hyper edits of this and most other devlog videos. I show how much time this takes for a reason. Just work when you can and when you have the mental capacity to do so. And don't feel too discouraged by all the things you see online of how fast people are actually moving, because most likely they're not. It's just heavily edited, that's all. Alright, and now we're ready for the real challenge. The monster in the night. I started by looking for a monster. I added it, fixed the bugs that came from adding it, and then hated it and replaced it. I added animations and voila! All in the span of a good 7 hours, I have a working, semi-working monster. So remember when I said when things are starting to take more time as the game kind of grows and as you add more to the game itself? Yeah, this halfway point moment was when I really felt that.
I don't know what it's doing. Help me.
I then started to program in the spawner. The idea was that the monster could spawn in random places. If it was too far away, it would slowly walk towards you. But if it could walk towards you, it should also kind of stop at a specific range away from you and ensure that it collides with other monsters so that they don't really kind of overlap each other constantly. This resulted in flying, floating, and sometimes disappearing monsters. Additionally, the monsters shouldn't spawn if the player was looking at a spawner, but delay their spawn instead. It should also keep track of all the monsters and have a calculation so that the amount of monsters spawning kind of ramps up throughout the night so that the player is not immediately overwhelmed. Because all of this monster spawning and the monsters trying to get you was happening while the player was trying to stay focused on counting sheep. This only took about Wait, what? 20 hours? Yeah, so do you see how I made like just one small segment in the script go by in a few seconds? And it actually took the most amount of time so far? Yeah, I just want you to keep that in mind when you watch your next devlog and maybe feel demotivated because you feel like you were going too slow. Again, heavily edited. Anyway, I had some more bugs left to figure out. I wanted to make it so that the monster would look at the player as they moved around. I also had to ensure that the spawner cleaned up all the monsters when a day started and tweak some of the positions and speeds of the monsters themselves. This took another 6 hours of work, especially making the monster look at the player, which was a freaking journey. I followed this up by adding the ability to destroy the monsters and added some extra feedback of a flickering light while you're trying to destroy them. I also made this transition that would play as you go from the night back into the day, and this was another 3 hours of my life vanished in the wind. Then I moved on to the most fun thing to create in a horror game, which was the jump scare. And I made it functional in about 2 hours. With the amount of time now left, I entered my final stretch. And in my final stretch, I started adding sounds. So I recorded, edited, and implemented sounds into the game. I had an ambiance playing, a heartbeat and breathing intensity that would change according to how many monsters were in the room and how close you were to a jump scare, sounds for the flickering lights, and then the jump scare itself, which really sucked to make. And finally, a typing sound for the transition. Now, the original implementation of the sound was done in a very shitty way. I then had to tweak it to be implemented in a more sophisticated way, and this made it so that I had to create the whole sound system twice and tweak the code to ensure that the sound would play right. This all in all took me 11 hours, putting me at the mighty 99. And 99 hours in, I had this. Now, you might be wondering what I did in my final hour, and I'll get to that in a bit. This is just a supercut of the journey I started all the way back in October of last year. If you want to see everything in a bit more detail, I have a playlist over here where you can see every single episode in a bit more detail and follow my frustrating journey of talentless development. If in addition you want to stay tuned, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. And with more feedback, my game will get better, so if you have any ideas or want to give me feedback on the video format or anything like that, just leave me a comment. Oh, and in my last hour, I cried at the state of my channel. Alright, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.